Interaction in card games. Is it good or is it bad? We have Pleasant Kenobi joining us because there was a lot of discourse taking place on Twitter surrounding this very subject, and I thought we would pull you in, buddy, so we could just talk about some cards. How you doing? You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm great, and I'm very excited for this. It's a topic that I love. I'm known for playing these kinds of cards in my card game. I'm Vince, also Pleasant Kenobi on the internet. I make loads of Magic the Gathering content on the channel Pleasant Kenobi. It's not Star Wars themed as much as it sounds like that. And I cover all sorts, from gameplay through to like philosophy around the culture of like casual gaming. Also the tension between casual and non-casual, which is one of the points I'm going to talk about today. So yeah, lots of Magic content. And I also play Warhammer competitively and have a Warhammer channel too, which won't come up much today because there's not really prison elements in that game. But
let's get into it. So I think we should start off because we're going to be talking about everyone's favorite types of cards that are non-interactive. So stacks, floodgates, prison cards. So I think for our audience, who is not familiar with our respective games, why don't you go ahead, for all the non-Magic players out there, why don't you define like what a stacks card is, what a prison card is, because this is like a colloquial term. This isn't like, in the game or anything.
Sure. So stacks as a term in Magic comes from, I believe, and someone's going to correct me on this, I'm sure, but it comes from the card Smokestacks, which is one of the earliest like popular stacks pieces. And what a stacks piece is normally an onboard effect, a continuous effect on a card that alters the rules of the game is the best way to describe it. So it might change how cards are cast, it might change how resources are activated or used, and it normally turns them off, reduces them, or makes it difficult for someone to do things. And usually, we'll come more to this, they're normally parallel, and the strategy around them is to break that parallel by playing your deck, like missing the card that it turns off and so on. But we'll come to more of that in a bit. And prison and stacks are used interchangeably. Prison normally refers to archetypes in competitive games, and stacks pieces has become more of a popular term again because in the casual side of Magic, the multiplayer side of Magic, stacks is like a no-go. It's like a taboo. The casuals hate stacks.
I want to play my cards.
Yeah, exactly.
And so floodgates, for any of the non-Yu-Gi-Oh players listening to this, because I'm sure we'll get a definite degree of crossover here, floodgates are what we refer to as types of effects that essentially shut the opposing player off from being able to play the game in one respect or another. Floodgates have existed in Yu-Gi-Oh ever since like some of the very first sets of the game, as a matter of fact. I don't really know. Like, the first one that comes to mind is Rivalry of Warlords. I might show you that card a little bit later. But for the most part, yeah, it just, like you said, it's sort of similar to stacks. It denies that most of these effects are reciprocal, I will say. Some are one-sided, but mostly reciprocal, and we're going to get into why that's an issue later on. These are just effects that just deny both players from being able to access one part of the game. And so I think there's a lot of commonalities to what we're talking about, but I think in terms of when you apply it to our respective games specifically, there's a vast difference between like how the implications of these types of effects are in Yu-Gi-Oh versus in Magic. And so as someone who evidently loves to play these types of cards, why don't you go on and talk about why you feel that these cards are important, at least from a Magic perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess some context is good for how we start talking about this, right? Is because there was a tweet by a user, it was Dire Yu-Gi-Oh! They tweeted out like a picture of a stacks piece or rule setting card for the 4 games that they were aware of: Pokemon, Digimon, Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic. And I found it interesting because it was being engaged with primarily by Yu-Gi-Oh! Players. And I retweeted it talking about how stacks pieces have a bad rep in casual Magic, but the reality is that they're like a valid way to play in Magic because it's an archetype that is quite interactive. By its very nature, you are interacting because you are preemptively interacting. In some ways, it's like a tap-out control deck. I don't know if that term makes any sense to Yu-Gi-Oh! Players. In Magic, sometimes you have this reactive control where you don't tap your mana, so on your opponent's turn, you can use it to take actions and cast spells to interact with your opponent. Stacks or Prison will often, instead of doing that, just preemptively tap its mana and slam a thing that stops your opponent from doing something. So it's like doing it preemptively. And I think that's an incredibly interactive way to play Magic. Like, these decks are often going against like combo decks and stopping combo decks from doing their combo thing. There's often this thing where like stacks or prison decks are bad often into mid-range decks or decks that want to play a normal game of like fight you with monsters, where like combo decks want to do some sort of 16 card combo and the stacks player's like, whoa there, we can only cast 1 spell a turn now, and then like kill you slowly with some sort of like nickel and diming thing. So that's why I retweeted it, and that's why this conversation started. And then MBT got involved, and he's the king of ratios, and the Yu-Gi-Oh! Players were telling me I was wrong and such. But the point I was making about my game, or the game that I know the most about, is that I think Prison actually brings a lot of interesting both design space and like metagame share for Magic, because it helps with combo not just being the best thing to do, or combo versus control, for example.
I see. Now, let me ask you this. When it comes to these stax / prison / control decks that you're referring to, what are like the win conditions of these types of decks? Like, is it death by 1,000 cuts? Like, how are these decks winning, I guess?
Yeah, so traditionally... Yeah, traditionally they are death by 1,000 cuts. Traditionally it is like one of the famous old school Magic things is that you have Mishra's Factory or Workshop. No, sorry, Mishra's Workshop. Sorry, two very similar names. Workshop, which is a creature that becomes a robot. So you lock the person out of the game and then you turn your lands on into robots and you hit them with your lands because people can't cut. Yeah, it's really cool. It's really cool. And again, it has like share with control, because traditionally control will turn a corner, take over the game, and sometimes kill you with creature lands again. So that's the old school thing. In more recent time, as power creep has ramped up in the last 5 years, it's not quite that. Like the legacy prison deck of choice now slams the One Ring, which Yu-Gi-Oh players might have heard of as being the card that Post Malone bought for like, $2 million or whatever. But the One Ring is like a card advantage engine that you struggle to beat if it gets online. It draws you so many cards. So it used to be that, but now it's like lock piece, like aggro centerpiece, and let that thing like kill your opponent. Not even that slowly anymore. So it's kind of escalated as power creep's gone and stuff. I'm interested in. So I was going to ask you back. I'm interested in how this works on the other side. Like I got the impression that Floodgates just are a necessary part of the interaction, but everyone hates them, and I was a bit confused by how decks win through them or in spite of them.
Sure. So I think similar to what you're describing, there's two sides of it when it comes to Floodgates. So the first side of it is decks that are sort of what you're describing, where it's like a pure stun deck where it's just maxing out on every single viable Floodgate that's good in a particular metagame. So we're talking about things that prevent the opponent from being able to special summon, because that's like the main mechanic of our game, of being able to put our creatures onto the board. Being able to just activate or like really just interact in any way imaginable. You're just playing this critical mass of these Floodgate pieces, and then you might play either a burn card or burn cards to just slowly burn them away. For people who are wondering, I'm talking about like Mystic Mind Burn, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Or like traditionally, there's just big Floodgate monsters. So, I mean, I imagine you have stax pieces or, Floodgates on your monster effects as well. Like we have some monsters that just say, oh, like your opponent can't, or both players can't special summon, or both players can't activate monster effects. And so they're meant to just shut down the game, simplify it, and then you just poke them a few times and, that's the end of the game. So that's our sort of like control side of it. But where it gets a bit murky from the Yu-Gi-Oh side is the fact that combo decks can also play Floodgates. So let me explain. So if a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh is, I wouldn't say like combo-centric in the fact that there's the meme of, oh, Yu-Gi-Oh players take 30 minutes to play their turns, whatever. The thing is, within a singular turn of Yu-Gi-Oh, a good analogy is that one single turn of Yu-Gi-Oh is 2 to 4 turns of like a regular card game, because both players have access to anywhere from 3 to 15 copies of like different variations of Force of Will for all the Magic people that are out there. And so while I, as the turn player, am playing out my turn, my opponent has access to all of these interactive pieces that they can play for free to try to slow me down. So you're doing all these like linear micro combos to try to like develop a board and then like pass back to the opponent and interact that way. The issue arises with Floodgates in that you only need 1 to 2 cards out of your 5 to 6 opening hand to execute these types of combos, because an individual card in Yu-Gi-Oh is so powerful. So that remaining 3 to 4 cards you have in your hand can be used for any of these type of Force of Will-like effects, or in this case, Floodgates. And so you can do your thing, set up your whole board, and then you can set your Floodgates behind it. So now when your opponent tries to reciprocate on their turn, you are now no longer susceptible to the reciprocal double-sided effect of this particular Floodgate. You're preventing them from being able to access an entire part of the game, because the Floodgates in Yu-Gi-Oh seem to be a lot more crippling in terms of what they actually affect versus Magic. And you can argue if you feel like that's not the case. And then now your opponent has to try to fight back with about half as many resources, because half of those resources are shut off because of this particular Floodgate. So I think because combo has access to the Floodgates as well, it's not like it's just slow stall control that's playing them. Everything has access to them, because in Yu-Gi-Oh there's not really any deck building limitation that says you can or can't do something otherwise.
I've got 2 questions around that are like sort of like, so one direct one is the term Floodgate, I assume is to do with it's meant to stop the flood of the torrent of like power, if you will. Like someone just doesn't just like cast all their spells or make all their creatures, do all their summons, and then win. Right? A floodgate stops that. Is that where the name comes from?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So that's cool. It's a very good name and it makes a lot of sense. The other question I had was, obviously floodgates have this negative vibe I'm getting from Yu-Gi-Oh! Far more than Stax in Magic. Even though there's two crowds. Like I said, the competitive players don't really complain about Stax or Prison. It's the more casual side that are playing like the multiplayer variants where Stax is considered more of a taboo because it slows the games down, right? That's like more like that. That's why I asked him, one of my tweets was like, is this just like casual players being louder than the competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Players? That's like one of the questions. The other thing is, are people upset about the free interaction like the Force of Will effect? Force of Will for people in Yu-Gi-Oh! It's a free spell in Magic. You have to pitch a blue card from your hand, you can counter a spell without having to pay mana. It's very good at stopping degenerate combos in older formats. Those cards, again, are not liked by casuals. When you talk about casual commander and multiplayer Magic, Stax is bad, free counter Magic is bad, fast mana is bad, all this stuff that kind of fundamentally makes the game a lot faster and perhaps more interactive. Is free spells or free counter spells like frowned upon or looked down upon, or?
No, it's actually the opposite, as a matter of fact, because with these, so we call these Force of Wills we're referred to, we call these hand traps. The reason we call them hand traps is because trap cards, historically, are the cards that you can flip face up on your opponent's turn. You know, you activated my trap card, right? So so hand traps, these are, funny enough, they're not trap cards, though. They're monsters, but they are monster cards that you can, during your opponent's turn, discard from your hand to the graveyard to do something to stop your opponent. I'll show you a simple one here just to...
Is Ash Blossom one of these?
Ash Blossom is, yes, exactly. So
yeah, I own one copy of Ash Blossom because of a viewer 5 years ago, a fan of Yu-Gi-Oh! Sent one to me. So
I'll ping one to you over in Discord. This is Effect Veiler. This is one of the very first ones that did this. If you want to give it a read, basically it just says during your opponent's turn, main phase specifically, you can just discard this card from your hand and then you target an effect monster they control and it negates the effect. The monster stays on the field, so in terms of card advantage, you're down a card, but you're preventing your opponent from going off. So it is similar to Force of Will in a sense. Force of Will, I think, would obviously, take out the monster with it. We have a stronger version of this, but I'm just showing.
Yeah. So just so I can make the comparisons in Magic, effect is... for the people watching at home, like, how little does this man know? I've played some Dual Links, the smaller speed Yu-Gi-Oh! I've played some of that, okay? So when you say effect, is this Effect Veiler, the one that you're showing me, does that stop a trigger, like an activated ability or trigger on the monster, or does it turn off all text on the monster for like a turn? How does that stopping an effect work?
The entire text of the monster on the card. So it's actually both. So like if you play the monster and then let's say it has 2 or 3 different abilities on that monster, if one of them is triggering, not only will it negate that effect that's triggering in that moment, so you would put Effect Veiler on the stack, or you would chain it in our instance, it would not only negate that, but then it negates all the rest of the text on that card as well until the end.
Okay, okay, interesting.
Right, so we have a million different variants of Effect Veiler that target specific aspects of the game. So you mentioned Ash Blossom. Ash Blossom specifically doesn't negate effects, but it negates the effects of things that would add a card from deck to hand. So if you play any cards that draw you cards, Ash Blossom can negate that. It can stop things that special summon monsters to the field. So we have all these different targeted pieces of these types of effects, but people actually really love them because they're really interactive and you're able to actually play around them in certain instances versus these floodgate types of effects where once they get flipped, there isn't really much counterplay whatsoever. I think a good example of this was the one that was from the tweet, as a matter of fact, which is Anti-Spell Fragrance. So Anti-Spell Fragrance, this is actually historically actually this might be the first floodgate now that I think about it, because this card is very old but didn't see play until a lot later on because it just became a lot better as a result. But Anti-Spell Fragrance, this is a continuous trap card. All these floodgates are typically continuous, so similar to an enchantment in Magic where it just stays out on the field once it's played. It says both players must set spell cards before activating them and cannot activate them until their next turn after setting them. So spell cards are like sorceries in Magic where typically you just play them, the effect resolves, and then they go to the graveyard. Anti-Spell Fragrance essentially turns these cards into trap cards where they have to be set face down for a turn before you can actually use those cards on the next turn. It definitely slows the game down, but the problem with this card is that when I'm able to use all of my spell cards on my turn and then do the thing and then set Anti-Spell Fragrance, I pass play to my opponent, I flip Anti-Spell Fragrance, now all of their spell cards aren't able to be used. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has, when it comes to spell cards, decks are comprised of, primarily 50% spell cards, and that's key to a lot of decks being able to execute whatever their game plan is. when half of that is shut off just because of a singular card, and there isn't, and ironically, some of the only ways to deal with a card like Anti-Spell Fragrance are in fact spell cards, it feels really bad for the opponent because it's like, oh, I don't even get the chance to fight back in a fair way, if that makes sense.
So do these cards get banned often?
As of recently, there's been a shift in the mindset of Konami. We don't understand how or why they ban certain cards. Unlike Magic, they do not tell us these things. So, but recently, they've actually gone on a crusade of limiting a lot of these cards down to a singular copy. We don't know why they just don't ban them, because a lot of people are very unhappy with them. Because these types of effects, when they limit one, people just find the next best one and will just start playing that. And so that's the unfortunate part of it. But there's been a recent crusade to get these cards out of the game, thankfully.
So it's interesting you talk about this. So I think part of the anti-spell fragrance, like, example you've given me, where you do your stuff, sit a trap card, and then your opponent can't do any of their stuff. It sounds like the difference with Magic to Yu-Gi-Oh! And why I would argue they're not a problem in Magic, except for when you're playing this casual etiquette thing of you're not allowed to stop me doing my thing. When you're playing in a competitive level, is that the action economy and the resource systems of both games are so severely different. So in this case, in Yu-Gi-Oh, you just, and I don't mean this in a harsh way, but you just vomit out your hand and then spell fragrance them, and the opponent's like, well, you've got to do a lot of things and I haven't. Meanwhile, in Magic, it's very rare for you to slam a stax piece after, like, casting a load of spells, for example. There was a thing recently, I'll put it in Discord so you can have a look at this as well. This is the most recently banned stax piece. So this is Vexing Bauble. This was printed in a Paracrep set called Modern Horizons. We won't get into that, but they're much better than other sets, let's say. So Vexing Bauble is a 1-mana artifact that says whenever a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell. When you read it, and I did this during previous season, I was like, this is an artifact that allows decks to stop other degenerate inverted combos or combo decks from doing their combo thing. In Legacy we're talking about, which is like kind of like Yu-Gi-Oh! Where most cards are legal. It's the whole of Magic, right? What happened in reality was a combo deck that was already reasonably like on the fringes of being good became too good because what it could do was slam this on turn 1, then start doing its combo stuff, and your opponent's Force of Wills that we just talked about can no longer be cast because they get countered. And there's like Force of Will, Force of Negation. There's a third one called Daze where you have to like have an island in play to use it. All three of those things keep Legacy in check and keep the game working, probably similar to what Yu-Gi-Oh! Does with hand trap, because the deck that just goes turn 1 kill you can't turn 1 kill you because the blue decks are like, actually in the rock paper scissors I have hand traps to stop you. Vexing Bauble was like, actually I don't care if you have hand traps to stop me, I'm going to play this and I'm going to cast all these spells with this fast mana and just start drawing cards and doing crazy stuff, and the opponent's like, well, they had Vexing Bauble so I can't force will the Mystic Forge or whatever. So weirdly, we had a spell fragrance that stopped your opponent taking any actions or that could stop you, banned recently, but it's different to spell fragrance in the sense that it doesn't stop them doing anything, but it stopped them doing anything in your turn, so you have free range just to go absolutely wild, and your opponent can't do anything about it.
Let me ask you this: you said this is Legacy, right? That this happened in.
Yes.
What is like the average turn length of a game in Legacy? So like, let's say I'm doing my combo and I Vexing Bauble, and then it's like your turn, you can't do anything, or you're very limited what you can do. How many turns does it take from that point for the game to end at that point?
So I want to clarify that Vexing Bauble was unique Stax or Floodgate in the sense that it's not, you don't go Vexing Bauble past and your opponent does nothing, because it only stops free spells. So it tended to only stop the interaction in the turn of the combo player, weirdly. I've got another example that I'll show you this example now, because this is like the archetypal most famous Legacy Stax piece, or one of the two, right? This is Chalice of the Void. There are rules, nightmares, and angle shooting conversations we can have about this in a bit as well. Chalice of the Void, oh, it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. It's got several arts that are beautiful. There's one that's unreleased, I think, which is this one. This art here, where the chalice has got like a wormhole inside it. Oh, yeah, good stuff. So Chalice of the Void, one of my favorite cards of all time. Artifact, you play it, and it counters all spells of a certain cost. Now, again, very different to Yu-Gi-Oh! Because you guys have, like, free spells, right? But the normal case for this, you play it on 0, stops a lot of, like, the 0 mana stuff. You play it on 1, so you play a land that produces 2 mana on turn 1, play this from 1. And when you pass your opponent, in Legacy, most decks are made up of about 30 to 40% 1 mana spells. So suddenly, if Chalice of the Void resolves and they don't have their hand trap to stop it, they untap and they're like, I can't cast any of my cantrips to look at top cards of my library, can't cast my 1 mana creatures to aggro you, can't do all these things. So Chalice is more the example you just gave, where you're like, you pass, and the opponent does nothing. Legacy has this And Vintage. Vintage is this, but with all the banned cards restricted to one-ofs instead. So they're like the Yu-Gi-Oh formats in a way. Legacy has this reputation of ending in like 2 turns. Because some decks can kill you on turn 1 if you don't have Force of Will, for example. But the reality is, because Prison exists, and because other softer Prison decks exist, and the hand traps exist to keep people in check, there's like this ecosystem and metagame that really games end on like turn 6 or 7. Like it's not as slow as people believe it is. But sometimes it looks that way. I've got videos where commenters are like, Vince, that game ended on turn 1 because someone combo killed me or killed them. Or the game virtually ended on turn 1 because you go Chalice the Void on 1, Chalice the Void on 2, the opponent makes no game actions and loses in about 18 turns and effectively lost on turn 1. Those games are the ones that people like to point out as why Legacy is bad and why high-powered Magic is bad. But the reality is, actually, there's a lot of stuff in the in-between, and if you don't look at the extreme games, the non-games.
Yeah, it definitely seems like there's a lot of parallels between, like, modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And, like, Legacy and Vintage from what you're describing, because just the way you're describing it, you could interchange Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh! And, like, specific cards out, and there's a lot of commonalities. And that's not the way every game plays out, obviously. That's just, like, what you said. But in the worst, corner case instances, then that is sometimes what happens. I think, especially when it comes to Yu-Gi-Oh!, in the example where I'm talking about anti-spell fragrance, where I do a thing, and you have to imagine too, while I'm doing my thing before the anti-spell fragrance is even in play, we're already exchanging resources, right? Like my opponent's trying to use their hand traps to stop me from doing my play, so we're already in like a lower resource state, ideally, so that means they have even less resources to combat the anti-spell fragrance, if they even have the answer to counter it at all. So then, when the turn passes to them, they have very limited that they can do. Not to mention that most Yu-Gi-Oh decks have other forms of like interaction that are outside of just being able to floodgate them. So there might be ways that as like the player playing the anti-spell fragrance, I can also protect the anti-spell fragrance from you interacting with it. So say you even have the out for this particular card, which you'd have to draw it in that point.
What is the out? What is the out usually to spell fragrance?
So there's several. Obviously, there's any way to, if you have the ability to get some monsters onto the field that have the ability to pop cards, then that is a way to out it, but you're having to commit your resources into destroying the spell fragrance instead of actually like dealing with the other active threats that are on the board. So that's one way. The classical example is Mystical Space Typhoon or Cosmic Cyclone. It's a very typical old Yu-Gi-Oh card that just says, target a spell or trap card on the field and destroy it. Now, it's a spell card, but the reason it works as the out to anti-spell fragrance is because it's a quick play or an instant in your case. So during your turn when I pass play, I would activate anti-spell fragrance before it's your main phase, so that means your spell cards would be offline. You would put Mystical Space Typhoon or Cosmic Cyclone or any equivalent card on the stack to destroy the anti-spell fragrance before it resolves, because you're allowed to do that because we have interaction that way. The issue is that not only do you need that specific card, but some of these Floodgate cards are also tutorable within these specific decks, and some of these decks like have an alternate path that they can combo into to purposely get the card out of their deck so they don't have to draw it. We have 3 copies per card in a deck versus your 4. So that way it's not even a matter of, oh, did I draw the anti-spell fragrance or X Floodgate? You can, interchange that. However, I can just tutor it from the deck and I don't even have to worry about drawing it, which means you're at a severe disadvantage because you have to draw your 1 of 3 copies of, Mystical Space Typhoon, Cosmic Cyclone, what have you.
I assume there are tutors that can get you the answers, though. There must be some sort of toolboxy decks that can...
No.
Well, when I say, do you use the term tutor? Sorry, do you use the term tutor in Yu-Gi-Oh?
So we just say searchable.
Search for.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's like
for people who wonder what the hell I'm talking about, tutors in Magic are look for a thing in your deck,
right.
And they're just named after the very first version of it, Double Lock Tutor.
Right.
That's the only reason it's like that. I just remember I've got to try and unpack some of that language when talking to a Yu-Gi-Oh audience because I don't want to lose people. So is there ways to search for the answers to spell fragrance?
Typically, no. Again, it's really like if a monster. So typically in Yu-Gi-Oh, you know how we have archetypes. So we have a lot of our cards are named a certain thing, right? And so they sort of all go together because they synergize, and that's how Yu-Gi-Oh. That's kind of like the equivalent of our color pool, because while we don't have different deck building by like red, black, blue, the incentive of playing one archetype over another is like, oh, this offers X, Y, and Z benefit, and this archetype offers A, B, and C benefit. So which one do I think is better? Some archetypes have built-in removal, and within these archetypes, typically the cards within a particular archetype are very tutorable with one another. So card A can get to card B, can get to card C within the archetype. A card like Mystical Space Typhoon or Cosmic Cyclone, for instance, we call these generic cards. Generic in the sense that any deck can play them. They're not tied to a particular archetype, which is good in the sense that it doesn't mean you have to play a particular deck to play them, but it's bad in the sense because they're unsearchable in a lot of instances. And so you're hoping, similar to Floodgates, you're hoping to draw them, and some decks are able to tutor for Floodgates. Not all decks can like tutor for an out to stop the Floodgate.
How has that become? Okay, so I understand there's archetypal like Blue Eyes and Dark Magician. These are archetypal things that other cards have, multiple cards have the names of.
Sure.
If the generic removal spells for Floodgates are not archetypal, they're generic, how come there are things that tutor for Floodgates? The Floodgates tend to be in archetype.
The way that you tutor these Floodgates is not like, oh, this card says search for X Floodgate and add it to your hand. You go through a series of steps to roundabout get it into your hand. So for instance, there will be a card that says send any card from your deck to the graveyard, okay? Then there's another card that will say add any card from your graveyard to your hand, or set a trap card from your graveyard to the field. So you have to go through these extra steps in order to execute this line of play to get yourself in a position that you might actually, it might be inefficient for you to do this from like a resource perspective, but you're doing it in hopes that it's going to lock the opponent out from winning the game, and you don't have to put any more effort in, because again, a lot of these decks in Yu-Gi-Oh can combo in such a way that you're putting so much damage on the field on the following turn that the game is effectively over on the next turn.
Sure. So you can do that for the answers then. You could go, so Magic has the exact same stuff. So there's a tutor called Entomb, which is one mana, and you search for a creature in your deck and put it into your graveyard. And then normally that's not used for staxing, that's normally used for reanimator. So you get the biggest thing you can, that you pay 1 mana, put it into play, and normally the stax player is like, oh, I played Chalice of the Void on 1, you can't cast Entomb. That's kind of the interaction. Those roundabout ways get your Floodgate online, and the Floodgate turns off those roundabout ways.
Right, the Floodgate itself will turn out the roundabout ways, but you're also having to deal with anything else that your opponent might have in addition to that. So for instance, let's say I have Anti-Spell Fragrance, and let me just show you this card here as an example. This is a very simple one. This is a card here. This is an old card, but for the purposes of this makes sense. This is called Void Ogre Dragon. Void Ogre Dragon says, once per turn when your opponent activates a spell or trap card, in this case you have to have no cards in your hand, but there's plenty of other effects that negate a spell or trap card. You can just negate and destroy it. So if I have Anti-Spell Fragrance and Void Ogre Dragon, not only are you not able to use any of your spell cards, if you do eventually find a way to get to a card that can out the Anti-Spell Fragrance, then Void Ogre Dragon could just negate that card anyway. So it's just inevitable that the game is just going to ultimately end in that way.
Right, and also Void Dragon can just kill you as well.
Precisely, because typically this monster in particular is 3,000 attack, but you might have multiple monsters. Maybe some of those monsters don't have an effect to prevent the opponent or protect the Anti-Spell Fragrance, but they might have enough attack because there's only 8,000 life points in Yu-Gi-Oh! Maybe you have a big card like Void Ogre Dragon, and maybe you have another guy that has, 2,000 attack. You're only a stone's throw away from being able to just deal 8,000, directly to them, especially when you have a full another turn to do what it is that you want to do to win the game.
I'm going to ask you the dumbest question that I was planning to ask earlier, but you kept saying things that made me want to ask other stuff. Anti-Spell Fragrance says that your spells, your sorceries, as you described them to me, are basically, they come into play tapped and they can't be used for following turn, right? Absolutely. Your monsters and your summons, they aren't spells, right?
Correct. Those are not spells. Those are monsters.
Okay, good. So there's two caveats to why I'm asking this. Firstly, just for the Yu-Gi-Oh players know, if you look at Chalice of the Void again, it says spell. That is all spells. That's all creatures, artifacts, enchantments, sorceries, instants. Because in Magic, spell means anything you cast.
That's a good distinction.
So weirdly, Chalice of the Void I don't think is anywhere near as brutal as this anti-spell fragrance sounds like, but it can be, because like I said, you can't play your 1-mana creatures or your spells. That's the first thing. The next question is, so the reason Chalice is the archetypal famous legacy stacks piece is because the format is all cards that are legal in Magic, similar to how Yu-Gi-Oh works, right? So it's a race towards efficiency. Everyone's decks are trying to do the most they can for the least amount of resources. In the case of Magic, it's obviously mana, right?
That sounds very
If you're really not aware, yeah, it does sound very Yu-Gi-Oh! But in Magic, you have lands that produce mana. That's a very simple thing. But no, what I'm saying is in Legacy, you want to play a land, use 1 mana, and do a lot with it. So what Chalice of the Void does is it aims for a very specific meta game. So when you're playing Legacy, if people are playing the normal decks, if you play Chalice on 1, it's back-breaking, and they've got to want to have Force Days or Force Negation or similar to stop it. If you play a legacy prison deck that relies on Chalice into a standard deck, which is the cards in the last 5 years of Magic or whatever, Chalice is often just very bad, because all the removal spells become 2 mana or 3 mana, and the threats are 4 mana and 5 mana, and Chalice just ends up being bad. So the question I'm kind of getting to is that Chalice is very specifically very good in Legacy and can be okay in Modern, which is a certain period of Magic as well. But when you get into the less efficient Magic, Chalice becomes a harder thing to pinpoint target at. It's a metagame choice in a way. So are there not decks, for example, in Yu-Gi-Oh, that someone slams Anti-Spell Fragrance, thinks they've locked you up, and then you just unload 4 monsters and go to town? Is there not an aggro or non-spell-based deck that's like, actually, I know the game is normally 50% spells, but my deck takes advantage of not being floodgateable by playing a different strategy? Is that not a thing?
That is a thing. So there's multiple examples of this. So a good example is a deck that is comprised of primarily trap cards. So there are control decks, which, funny enough, ended up shifting into combo control decks. I'm talking about Labyrinth for anyone who's watching this. These are decks that are primarily comprised of trap cards as well as monsters, and maybe only play 2 or 3 spells. But the problem is those decks may, while they can, maybe they completely ignore Anti-Spell Fragrance's existence, they're not good enough to compete with how strong the decks are otherwise, or there are other floodgates that, especially if you're playing in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! In games 2 or 3, when you're going into sideboarding, there are even more hateful floodgate cards for these types of strategies that make it that in the later games that you're going to be at a severe disadvantage, because now you have all this other targeted hate for your specific trap-based deck. But there are plenty of decks that, for the most part, monsters are the core of Yu-Gi-Oh! And, spell cards are second to that, but so many spell cards have abilities that say special summon a monster, or like they are spells that basically are getting you 2 other monsters at the end of the day. And so, because you're locking the opponent out, well, yes, your hand, let's say you have 2 or 3 monsters in your hand and the others are 2 or 3 spell cards. Okay, Anti-Spell Fragrance is up, half of your hand is turned offline. You can still do a lot with those 2 or 3 monsters, but the problem is at that point, if your opponent has ways to interact with those monsters and prevent them from being able to do what it is that they're trying to combo off to do, because again, in Yu-Gi-Oh!, a singular monster can result in quite a lot just because the power of a single monster is so great. If they stop, let's say those 2 or 3 monsters, only all of them need to be normal summoned in order to be able to do that. We get 1 normal summon per turn, where special summoning is unlimited. If you need to normal summon all 3 of these, you can only pick 1. So if I normal summon that monster and my opponent has a way to destroy it or negate the effect or anything like that, then my turn is over because the other 2 monsters in my hand aren't going to be able to do anything because I'm limited by the game mechanics at that point. Anti-Spell Fragrance is shutting off the 3 spell cards in my hand, so I can't use those. So I can set those spell cards face down, pray my opponent can't kill me, which is very unlikely, and that's just the end of it. So
is special summoning normally only through spells, and thus like the pinch point for floodgates really harming the playability of like loads of different strategies? Is that spells are too important and thus floodgates for spells are the problem?
No, because I can show you right here, like this is one of the most notorious ones as well. I mentioned how special summoning is so crucial to the game. This is very infamous. This is Vanity's Emptiness. So Vanity's Emptiness says neither player can special summon monsters. It does have a way to remove itself. It says when a card is sent from the deck or the field to your graveyard, destroy this card. So similarly to Anti-Spell Fragrance, a lot of people would play in such a way that they, try to just build their board as best they can. During the opponent's turn, they immediately flip Vanity's Emptiness. Maybe they have a way to protect the Vanity's Emptiness so that it doesn't destroy itself if any of your cards were to be destroyed. And then the opponent's basically just locked out of the game. So this is like the opposite of Anti-Spell Fragrance in the sense that your spells are online, but now your monsters can't be special summoned, and now you're really hindered by your ability to actually get monsters on the field, right? And so the spell cards have a wide variety of different effects. Some spell cards, when you're going second, like let's say I do my thing, I set up my board, if there's no Anti-Spell Fragrance, there are several spell cards that say, oh, I'm going to destroy all monsters on your field, or I'm going to take control of one of your monsters, or I'm going to draw more cards to help me find ways to deal with what it is that I'm looking against. And spell cards in Yu-Gi-Oh!, because we don't have mana, you can use as many of these spell cards as you want, barring any restriction that it says, oh, you can only use this card once per turn. right? So if I'm able to use these cards to either get monsters to my field to fight back or to dismantle and pick apart my opponent's board, whether it's a board wipe, such as Dark Hole, which literally just says, like, destroy all monsters on the field. If it's a card that takes control of opponent's monsters to help, like, use that to fight back. There's just a wide array of different effects that spell cards have, but by limiting the ability to use those spell cards, or similarly with Vanity's Emptiness being able to special summon monsters, your options being so limited is really crippling on the opposing side of it if you're staring one of these types of effects down.
Because like, I'm not here to preach about the mana system of Magic.
No, of course.
UK players also hate it. It's a regular conversation, right, where people are like, the one thing Magic's got wrong is that land thing. But the land mana progression system allows almost like, if you imagine balancing Magic cards or any card game cards as dials to turn, and one of those dials is how much they cost, right? But on the flip side of that, one of those dials is how does stax pieces or prison pieces interact with that? Chalice of the Void, for example, doesn't turn off your entire strategy. It turns off a specific mana cost, which in the case of Legacy, some decks are like, oh, the Chalice resolved, and my deck is very greedy and only plays 1-drops. Sure. I'm wrecked here. Inherently, the resource system of Magic allows these cards to be, I guess, less overall brutal, although they often are. Here's an example of that. So, like, Blood Moon. Have you ever heard of this card?
I think I've heard of it. I don't think I know what it is.
Yeah.
Let's take a look.
Again, this is like Chalice of the Void, right? This is another really famous one. So this is an enchantment, not an artifact. It's got a different type. And it says non-basic lands are mountains. So in Magic, just to explain, there are 5 basic land types. Technically, there's 6 with wastes, but I won't go into that. There's an age for each color of mana in the game to cast spells. Because of over the years they've printed different dual lands and lands that create different mana and stuff, most decks don't play any basics or many basics at all. So what it is that people will play lands that produce 2 colors each, which are non-basic. And so what happens is when you slam a Blood Moon and your opponent's got 3 non-basics in play and they're playing a blue-white deck, suddenly their lands don't produce blue-white anymore, they produce red, and they can no longer cast any of their spells. And again, Blood Moon has counterplay because sometimes you'll play against a casual player who doesn't even own dual lands. They have basic lands. Like, oh, I already got a basic island, a basic swamp, and a basic plains. And you're like, well, you can cast your spells. But the expensive person's deck, the deck where the card, like, original duels are like $600 to $1,000, right? You slam a Blood Moon and suddenly your $1,000 duels don't do anything. They just produce red mana. But again, if your opponent's on mono red where they're only playing mountains, it does nothing. So again, Blood Moon is hated to the point that competitive players have moaned about Blood Moon in the past. I won't name any names. But if you aren't greedy, inverted commas, if your deck actually plays loads of basics or ways to fetch basics, because some of our lands tutor for other lands in a very... I won't get into that too much, but you can fetch around it. So if you know your opponent's on Blood Moon, because you're post-board and you're thinking they've sided into their Floodgate, which is Blood Moon, you're like, I should probably fetch my basic forest here. So when Blood Moon comes down, I still have access to green mana and stuff. So again, the mana system gives and takes. It gives ways to mess with mana, like Blood Moon, which can be, again, in casual circles. Casuals hate this. They get very upset if you turn all their lands into mountains in a multiplayer game. But on the flip side, it gives this counterplay where, like, you have to respect these things in certain formats, otherwise you're going to get got. And it's kind of like a gotcha. Sometimes you untap and you look at your opponent's board and they've tapped out and all their lands are non-basic and they've got 1 creature in play and you're like, I'm going to slam Blood Moon, next time I play a blocker, and they're out of the game because they can't do anything. And some people think that play pattern is, what's the word I'm looking for? Just not very fair or fun. But personally, I'm like, actually, I think it's very fun. Like, you can get got by things that, like, turn off your stuff if you are playing in a way that doesn't respect those things, you know? So the resource system gives both. It giveth and it taketh away, I guess, is what I'm getting at there.
Yeah, it definitely seems like, at least from what I'm seeing, and obviously I could be wrong, but it seems like in terms of what our floodgates are disabling versus your stax pieces, is that a lot of your pieces are a bit more forgiving in it shuts off something, but there's still a lot of other ways to work around it, where a lot of our floodgate cards are just really punishing or sort of all do the same thing but with different text. And as a result of that, because anti-spell fragrance, for instance, is shutting off an entire third of the card pool, right? And let's be honest, in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, trap cards aren't even really relevant. So if you're going to look at, okay, people are playing monsters and spells, and if most decks are comprised of half spells, if not more, then you're literally shutting off and disabling over 50% of someone's deck with a singular card. Vanity's Emptiness is similar since monsters are the core of the game. If I'm disabling 50 to 70% of my opponent's ability to play the game because so much of the game is centralized around special summoning, thank God this card's banned, by the way, because this card's been banned for a while now, then that's not particularly fun. So I think it's a combination of, it seems like our Floodgates are a lot more egregious in terms of like how powerful they are, and also the fact that the ways to potentially interact with them are also a lot more limited in the sense that it isn't like sort of baked into the mechanics of like, oh, mechanically I can play it like with what you're describing with Blood Moon and the fetch lands, right? Where you can sort of play around it just based off of the way that the game is already designed. Where with Yu-Gi-Oh, it sort of goes back to that argument of, oh, better draw the out, otherwise, you know, you're not going to be able to play the game, which isn't particularly fun.
And that does come up with Blood Moon, draw the out. So, for example, there's a free Force of Will has led to a lot of different Force cards existing recently. Force of Vigor is the green one, which is exile a green card from your hand, and you can destroy 2 artifacts or enchantments. So in some matchups, Chalice of the Void will be on 1, Chalice of the Void will be on 2, and Blood Moon will be in play, and it looks like your opponent's never playing a game of Magic, and then they'll go, oh, I'm going to exile this green card, Force of Vigor, the Blood Moon, and the Chalice on 1, untap with my lands, play a spell, and you're like, oh. So sometimes it is a case of drawing the out. But I also think that's kind of part of card games generally, just maybe turned up to the nth degree because we're playing at high power levels. Like you're like, my opponent's probably on Blood Moon, I should side in these extra copies of Force of Vigor, and so on, right? I kind of like that counterplay. I like that sort of thing.
I think it's also just a symptom of, I mean, Yu-Gi-Oh's 25 years old, Magic's like 30 at this point. I mean, the games have sort of accelerated to the point where, you know, we're seeing just, you know, complexity at its peak, right? I mean, no one expected these games to last as long as they did, and so I think a great example of this card is Abyss Dweller, as a matter of fact. So I'll show you this card really quick here. You can give it a read. The important part of the text here is that it says, it's the bottom sentence. It says, you can detach an Xyz material from this card. Any card effects that activate in your opponent's graveyard cannot be activated this turn. This card was printed over a decade ago. I want to say it was like 2012, 2013. During that time, while Yu-Gi-Oh was still, you know, explosive and fast-paced, it wasn't nearly to the degree that it was now. So this is what we call a lingering floodgate. So it's lingering in the sense that it's an effect that will prevent the opponent from accessing their graveyard, but it only lasts for the duration of the turn. And unfortunately, it is a quick effect, so you can use it during either player's turn. But it also is limited in the fact that you can only use it twice, because typically Abyss Dweller is only going to have 2 activations of this ability. So eventually, you can wait out Abyss Dweller to have access to your graveyard once again. During the time that Abyss Dweller was printed, there were a few decks that would take advantage of the graveyard, and Abyss Dweller was a fine option to be able to not necessarily guarantee that you're going to win the game, but slow those decks down or put them in a check sort of scenario where it's like, okay, this card is going to help me win the game if you don't have a way to deal with it. Older Yu-Gi-Oh wasn't nearly as fast as modern Yu-Gi-Oh is, and there would be several turns taking place where you could find a way to possibly deal with this Abyss Dweller, or wait it out in such a way that then once the Abyss Dweller can no longer activate its effect, you would then be able to use your graveyard and possibly swing the game back around in your favor. Because of how Yu-Gi-Oh has evolved and how fast the game is, I mentioned how 1 turn of Yu-Gi-Oh now is like 2 to 4 turns in other games. Because of that, Abyss Dweller now is way stronger as a result of the game's sort of evolution, because now being able to shut the graveyard off for a singular turn when there's very few ways to interact with an effect like this is just game-breakingly strong, and is a way that, oh, if Abyss Dweller resolves, the game is just going to end, essentially.
You said it's a quick effect too, right? So do you mean that you pass to their turn, and then in the beginning of their turn sequence, we have the upkeep or whatever, you'd activate Abyss Dweller to turn off for their turn, is that right?
Correct, right. So basically, you would pass turn, you would they would take their first action, which is drawing for a turn. Once they draw, in their draw phase, you can just immediately fire the Abyss Dweller.
Sure, yeah.
And what's annoying about this is that Abyss Dweller, you have to interact with the Abyss Dweller when the effect is activated, and this is what I was referring to when I say lingering floodgate, is because even if you remove the Abyss Dweller from the field, its effect will still linger for the duration of the turn. So that makes it even more frustrating, because even if you have a way to deal with it, like let's say you have a way to attack over it, because he's very weak, he's only 1700 attack. If you have any monster that is 1800 or more, you can just summon it and crash into it, right? But if you don't negate that effect immediately, your graveyard shut off for the rest of the turn.
But if you kill it with a creature, the lingering effect still lingers, right? If I kill it with my... Yeah, okay.
Correct. And so that's what makes it even more frustrating, is because you have to negate the effect as on activation if you want to have access to your graveyard for that turn. And there's very few cards at quick effect speed or instant speed that are able to interact with an effect like this. So Abyss Dweller actually recently just got banned in the Asian territories, and a lot of people would not be surprised if it gets banned in the non-Asian territories as well.
See, that's wild to me, because if I look at a magic card that stopped opponents from targeting their graveyards for 1 turn, or even for 4 turns, well, maybe that's a bit more actually. If I think of it as 4 turns, I can see that maybe. But even then, like, we rarely ever get the cards that turn off effects. Like Vexing Ball being banned is so unusual. I want to show you a lingering one-off spell. You might even have this directly in Yu-Gi-Oh! Okay, so this is moving away from enchantment and artifacts. This is silence. 1 mana. Your opponent can't cast spells this turn. So the 2 ways it's used is 1, you like time warp or turn your opponent's turn off for a turn. You in their upkeep, you cast silence. If they don't have instants or quick effects, they can't cast creatures or cast spells in the main phase. But the real way it's used is normally you cast this, and then you can start to combo off and your opponent can't. It's protection for your combo. But it's a similar thing in a way. And there's lots of cards that I love. I've got a tattoo here of Richard and Port, for example.
That's sick. That's cool.
I'll show you this one as well. This is again another thing that's kind of like what you're explaining, but maybe a little bit less. Again, everything's less brutal because of the resource system, I think. So Richard and Port, I'll show you the actual good art though, none of this old art. New art, sorry. I need the old art, sorry. Richard and Port is a land, so it's one of your lands in your resources that then has 1 mana and tap it to tap target land. So in your opponent's upkeep, before they draw a card, you activate this and you tap one of their lands. So they're now a land down. It's like turn 1 or 2 of the game, right? And the other thing, when you got 2 of them, and when you're up to like 4 mana and you got 2 of them, you tap with their upkeep. They'll float the mana to do quick effects, and then you're like, okay, I'll proceed to your draw step. The mana goes away, then you tap another land in their draw step, and they're like, now I'm 2 lands down. And then you play another like a chalice effect that makes their spells cost 1 more, and before you know it, they've got 4 lands in play, but they can't cast a spell because 2 of them are tapped and their spells cost 1 extra. But again, it's all like prison in Magic is often just small edges that are brutal in the efficiency of the older formats. It's very, very rare to fully turn something off. Except,
right, and I think that's a huge difference for sure.
Yeah.
So we don't have this silence effect. The closest thing we this card is you might like the art on this. This one's sick. Hold on, let me get this pulled.
Well, see, I'm really surprised by that. I would have just assumed like you can't cast spells for a turn because you've literally shown me a card that is a pot of like incense that says you can't play spells full stop, right? Because anti-spell fragrance lasts. Is it forever?
It's permanent. It's permanent.
So that exists, but you don't have 1 spell, 1 quick effect that says you can't play spells this turn.
So this is the closest example I can think of, and I'm sure there's other people who might be able to think of other things down in the comments. So this is Outer Entity Azathoth. So this is not just like something you can play like Silence for 1 white mana and just make it so that they can't cast spells. This card is banned for context. So this card, the important part of the text here is that it says, after this card was Xyz summoned, let's just say you get it to the field, your opponent cannot activate monster effects for the rest of the turn. This is really funny because this effect actually doesn't activate. It's just when you play it, it just happens. There's no way to like really interact with this effect, which is like very annoying.
So there's no trigger you can respond to.
There's no trigger. This is like a rare card in Yu-Gi-Oh! That like when it's played, it does the thing. The ability does not go on a chain on the stack. It just happens. So there's no window to interact with this. You would have to stop it prior to it coming out. It's telegraphed if you know what it, like combo, but you have to jump through a lot of hoops to get to this particular card. And so people, when this card was legal, found ways so that they would summon an Azathoth, disable their opponent from being able to use hand traps, because hand traps have some counterplay. There's only a few cards that can counter a hand trap during your turn at instant speed. But Azathoth was just a way that as soon as it hit the board, they were all disabled and you were free to combo off. And so there's a lot of degenerate decks that from that point would either find a way to first turn kill the opponent or put themselves in a situation that they were just going to win the game.
This is Vexing
Some
Bobble.
players also found ways to...
This is Vexing Bobble.
Is it?
Yeah, wow. Vexing Bobble, once Vexing Bobble was resolved, the text on it just reads as it does. So you cannot do free spells. Which is what your hand traps are, right? They're the free interaction spells. This is Vexing Bobble.
But once it resolves, Azathoth, just once it hits the board, there's not even a point of like resolution. Like it's just going to happen. is the
So
thing.
I guess the question is, when you XYZ summon, this is more of a fundamental thing. Sorry, Yu-Gi-Oh players in the comments, but when you XYZ summon, you don't know what's coming.
Elaborate.
So, for example, okay, there's two examples. One, I cast in my turn. I cast a spell. I put it on the stack, and you can react to it with quick effects or instants. Right? That's the normal way of doing things. There's a card called Aether Vial. We'll get into a bit of weeds, but this will make sense in a second because this is a Staxy card too, right? So Aether Vial, again, a card that I own too many copies of because I love it. The important thing about this card is it charges up over time, but when you tap it to activate it, you can put a creature from your hand into play equal to the number of counters on it. When you activate it, you pass priority to your opponent. You've got an Aether Vial activation on the stack. They can do stuff, but the moment they say pass priority and let you resolve it, you resolve the whole thing, put the creature in, the creature is now there. There's no responses to it. So, for example, I'm sorry to give you one more card, but this makes the whole thing make sense. Phyrexian Revoker. So, for example, if your opponent has a thing in play they want to activate, and I activate Aether Vial on 2, and I ask any responses, and they say no, and Revoker enters off of the vial, I name the thing that they're trying to activate, they look down, they realize that I've named it, it's here now, Revoker's there, there's no point to respond, and they're like, oh, and then Revoker's named their, not a fetch land, but their Aether Vial, let's say, in the mirror. So in the circumstance that I cast something, you can see it coming, you know what's coming on the stack, you can respond. In an Aether Vial activation, you do not know what is going to show up until it's there, and at that point, its static effects are in effect. So when you XYZ summon, do you not have a target? Like when I say I'm XYZ summoning, I'm XYZ summoning.
I understand what you're saying. No, you don't declare what it is that you're summoning. So it is a XYZ summoning, or most mechanics that are involving the extra deck are a like sorcery speed. When you have turn player priority, you go into your extra deck, you do whatever it is you have to do in order to perform that summon. In this case, you'd have to overlay it on top of another card, but that doesn't matter for this case. So basically, I have that card on the field. My opponent does nothing. They say, that's fine. I go into my extra deck and just slap Azathoth down. There's no window at that point that they can do anything. If they had the ability to negate the summon of this monster, which can only be done with a specific or a series of specific trap cards, but if you're going first, they're not going to have trap cards down, which people would use this to go first so they could execute their combo. That's the only window to be able to interact with Azathoth, to be able to stop it from hitting the board. But
Because there are no hand traps that do it, right?
Correct. There's no hand trap that negates a summon, and especially once Azathoth hits the field. Most types of effects, when they would hit the field, it would activate, go on the stack, and then you would have the ability to, affect Veiler or Ash Blossom or whatever. But Azathoth, because of the way the card is worded and designed, it just shuts everything off immediately. And that was sort of the intent with the card, for better or for worse. Right, so this is a very rare effect in Yu-Gi-Oh! It's not very common, but people then found degenerate ways to summon Azathoth on the opponent's turn to make it so that they couldn't activate any monster effects, and then basically they would just have to pass the turn, hence why this card is now banned. There's another card that got banned recently for similar reasons, called Hot Red Dragon Archfiend King Calamity.
That's why Vial is a good comparison, because Vial can be activated at instant speed. So creatures that could never normally appear in your opponent's turn at instant speed, at quick speed, you activate Vial in their turn, it comes down. And the deck that plays Vial, Death and Taxes, my favorite deck in the history of Magic, plays loads of rule-setting stupid cards, like Revoker, like Thalia, which makes spells cost one more, and you just do it in their turn. So sometimes your opponent will cast a spell, like I said, they have a copy of Vial. You'll activate your Vial, put Revoker in, and name Vial, which also turns yours off. Their Vial resolves, they can't use Vial. There's loads of incredible situations like that. Can I show you my favorite gotcha card in all of Magic? Right, this card is my thoughts on it have changed over time, because Warhammer as a game has no hidden information, so it's made me play a lot softer and gentler with my opponents and communicate with them more. Where, I don't know if Yu-Gi-Oh is like this, in Magic, you can kind of not talk and still play Magic, because the rule system's so good. Exactly. This is Leonin Arbiter, which is a rules nightmare card. 2 mana 2/2. It's a cat cleric, largely irrelevant. It says players can't search libraries. Any player may pay 2 mana to ignore this effect until end of turn. The reason it's very strange is that there's no trigger. So normally for a trigger in Magic, it has to say whenever, it has to say, I think if is another one. There's certain words that cause a trigger. And a trigger goes on the stack, and opponents can respond to it. They can activate things and so on. Arbiter is actually what's called a special action, which is really like in the weeds of fucking rules and stuff, okay? So basically, if someone cracks their fetch land and you vial this in, for example, you stop their fetch land from working. The fetch land is just turned off because they can't search because they have the mana, right? If you have this in play and your opponent cracks a fetch and has not declared that they're paying and they pick up their library, they have begun to search and cannot, and you have to stop them and be like, sorry, mate, the arbiter's in play, right? You can't do this. I had an event where I've done a whole video talking about this. Someone at a GP, he was French. I think I played a German copy of this. He's French, I'm English, we're in Utrecht, right? It's just like different languages. And I'm like, do you understand what this card does? And he says, yes. He says, oui. I'm like, okay. He then proceeds to sacrifice all of his lands to do this combo. He gets to pick up his deck. I'm like, sorry, you have not paid. He doesn't get a chance to pay. There's not a trigger to pay. You have to pay before you do it. If you miss the paying, you've missed it. He fails to search. He loses the game on the spot by sacrificing all of his lands and can no longer play Magic. So yeah, Arbiter is like my favorite, like absolutely. And then you play cards on your side to really abuse it, where you blow up one of their lands or one of their creatures, and they can go search for another land or a creature. But if they haven't got the mana open, they can't do it. You do opportune times and stuff. So yeah, this card is very funny for catching people out. I used to call it Cat Jesus on the channel because it saves Magic. Yeah, it dies for last because the card's not very good. It dies a lot and it doesn't really kill people, right? But
here's a great analog though. I'm glad you showed me that because it's great. I just keep pulling up more cards the more we talk about this. This is great. This is a fan favorite. This is Thunder Dragon Colossus. There's a bit of text on this, but the important part here is the second half of the text here. It says, cards cannot be added from the main deck to your opponent's hand except by drawing them. So this is very similar to the arbiter that you just showed here. And then it says, if this card would be destroyed by battle or card effect, you can banish a thunder monster from your graveyard instead. So for context, how you summon this is basically if you activated a thunder effect in your hand, then you're able to take any of your thunder monsters that are on the field, go into your extra deck, tribute that monster, and just play this big guy onto the field. You also aren't restricted by how many times you can do that. So if you have 3 thunder monsters and you activated a thunder effect in hand that turn, you can sacrifice all 3 of those and summon 3 Thunder Dragon Colossus to your field immediately. Very anime, very cool. This card was banned for a significant period of time because it prevented the opponent from being able to add cards from their deck to their hand. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but the draw power in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is very bad just because a singular card, Magic has mana for its resources. Granted, in every card game, cards are resources, but because Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't have a mana system, the cards being the resource are so pivotal that denying the opponent from being able to access their deck when 90% of the card effects in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are going to say add one of something from your deck to your hand, not to mention this monster prevents the opponent from doing that. Sometimes in the very first turn of the game, you can stare down 3 of this thing, and it has built-in protection from being destroyed. This card was banned for actually quite a long period of time. I was going to say, if you tribute summon it, it puts a thunder monster in the bin, right? So it always comes with two like lives, if you will. This card, when I read it, I was like, this is my kind of thing, and then you told me it was banned. Well, it's legal again. It's legal again. So you can play it now if you want. They just recently unbanned it. Yeah. It's crazy because a card like this, there are a lot of ways to interact with it. For instance, it can still be targeted. So that means there's ways to get rid of it that way. There's non-destructive forms of removal, such as bouncing it back to the hand. In Yu-Gi-Oh! A monster from the extra deck would just get bounced back to the extra deck because it can't mechanically be in the hand. So that's a way to get rid of it. There are cards that send cards from the field to the graveyard. That's not the same as destroying. So that plays around this. It can be banished, which is exiling for Magic players. So there are ways to interact with this, but it's still a very frustrating effect. And Thunder Dragon is no longer the powerhouse tier 1 archetype that it was 7 years ago. So this card is back in the game now and probably isn't going to cause any issues. But
I guess it gets stronger and stronger the more tutoring people are doing, right? There's that argument too. Yeah. So this is a card that casuals hate. Right, casuals hate this. We're on the tutor hating. There's a lot of this stuff. I love this stuff. But Opposition Agent, which is played primarily in the multiplayer 4-player format. So this is a 3/2 for 3. It has flash, so you can play at any time. You control opponents whilst they're searching their libraries. Okay.
This would be so broken in Yu-Gi-Oh! If they printed this, I think Yu-Gi-Oh's over.
Have you read the third bit yet?
I have not. No.
Oh, so essentially, when you search the libraries, you get to exile those cards and cast them yourself. It is wild. It is so much fun. And because it's got flash, what happens is, so here's the floor for it, right? The floor. God. Someone cracks a fetch land to go find a plains. You flash this in, you find their plains, next turn you play it, right? Very simple. The ceiling is Green Sun Zenith for 8, which is go find a 8 costing creature from your library and put it into play. You just do that instead. You just go get it, you exile it. You still have to cast it, but yeah. So Opposition Agent is hated But it's so. I've got an anecdote for you. So Goblin Recruiter is banned in Legacy because it's a 2-mana 1/1 that says you can search your library for any number of goblins, put them on top of your library in any order, and it stacks your deck. It's not banned in the casual commander format. My friend at this event cast Goblin Recruiter, and I, in response, cast Opposition Agent. So I take every goblin in his goblin-themed deck, and this is a deck of 100 cards. So I take 60 goblins or whatever it is, I just exile them. And then someone walks past, and they're like, is that your hand? I'm like, no, this is half of Rob's deck that I now own in exile and can cast. Opposition Agent is such a funny card. This should be in Yu-Gi-Oh! So you have search hate, but you don't have search take control and cast their stuff, no?
No, I don't think we have anything. So the closest card we have to... This is actually a really interesting card. I like how this conversation has just evolved into us showing each other cool cards.
Yeah,
from
but they are stax cards. They're not all floodgates.
Well, the card I'm about to show you is not that, but this is the closest... I think this might be the closest analog we have to Opposition Agent. So this is a really, really cool card. So this is Lullaby of Obedience. So this is a spell card. It has the effect you have to pay 2,000 life points and declare a card name. Your opponent looks at their deck, reveals the declared monster if there is any, and then they choose one of the effects to be applied. So either they special summon that monster to your field, or they add that monster to their hand. I think this is the closest thing we have to this sort of effect. This card... Anytime there's a metagame where there's like a definitive like best deck, like tier 0 format, this card will see play because everyone's playing the same deck or virtually the same deck. And this is a cripplingly good card in the mirror match because it's essentially 3 copies of any other card in your deck because your opponent is playing it.
Wait. You can put your opponent's cards into your hand?
Correct.
Wow, so, that would never fly in Magic. Not even from like a broken, but like the mixing of like you can put them in exile. There's technology within the game design, exile and use them. I guess that's the same thing, arguably, right? Because you just keep it separate to your hand. But
so there are even instances where when people are playing mirror matches with this card, they will side out the card that people are always going to be calling off of this. So someone will go Lullaby of Obedience, call this, and the other person's just like, nope, and they actually don't have the card. Like, so the mind games with this card are incredible. I love this card. It's a very, I think this is a very well-designed card.
This is awesome. I love this. This actually exists in Magic a lot. There's a lot of these effects. I won't get them all up for you. Like Bribery goes and grabs a creature. Praetor's Grasp. There's loads of these, but they're not considered stacks in a way. Opposition Agent is great because it turns off a whole thing, and you control them, and you steal their stuff. It's just like wild. There's an Opposition Agent like card that is considered stacksy that is currently banned from Commander, the casual format, which I think is just, if I'm at least going to show you one more card, it's this one. So this says it's a 3-mana 3/2 that says Flash. Again,
I've seen this. This card is insane.
Yeah,
this card is nuts.
You get to gotcha people with Flash. But it says if an opponent would draw a card except for the first one they draw in their draw step, instead you create a treasure. A treasure is basically a spare mana. So people will cast spells in Commander that say like all players discard their hands and draw 7. And you're like, oh, did someone cast a wheel? And you cast this. And then all of the players at the table can't draw 7. And then you make 21 treasures. Or you're the person casting the wheel, then you cast this. So this got banned because in the casual format, there still needs to be a bit of like, people don't enjoy you doing this, please stop. Yeah, Hull Breacher is like, it's part, in Magic there's a thing called Super Cycles, which is like things that aren't in the same set, but they do a similar thing. There's Opposition Agent in black, there's Hull Breacher in blue, and we haven't really got a red, green, or white one yet. But I'm very excited to see when we finally get one of those what it looks like, because these are so gross for what they do.
I'm pretty sure I told CGB when he showed me this is the most broken Magic card he's ever shown me. Because by Yu-Gi-Oh standards, this card is nuts. You probably know this one. I'll show you the classic. It's good old Maxx. For any Magic players
I've never seen this. I've never seen this.
This is the most divisive card in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! So Maxx, this is a hand trap. It says, during either player's turn, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard. This turn, each time your opponent special summons a monster or monsters, immediately draw 1 card, and you can only activate it once per turn. This card is brutal because while it is a... so first of all, similar to Abyss Dweller, this is a lingering floodgate. So this card, you activate it. Unlike Abyss Dweller, you discard this card from your hand to do it. There are very few cards that can interact with hand traps when they're being activated like this. There's a couple, such as Call by the Grave and, Cross Out Designator for people watching. But those cards are limited to 1, which also doesn't help. But anyway, Maxx Very few ways to interact with it, for one. Ash Blossom actually can negate this card, so there are ways, but that's like 3 of 10,000 cards that can
The one hand trap I own.
Well, there you go. You can stop the Maxx C. But in any case, so this is another issue when it comes to like the whole Floodgate discussion, because as a Yu-Gi-Oh player, I can take my first turn, I can do the thing, whatever. If my opponent's throwing hand traps at me to slow me down, okay, sure, that's fine. Maybe they're down a card or two. I didn't get to my, like, you know, ideal end board, whatever. I've got some guys on the field. I pass the turn. My opponent starts their turn. I immediately just Maxx C them, and now they're put in the unwinnable dilemma, because if they want to fight back and actually try to, you know, play Yu-Gi-Oh with me, you need to special summon. Special summoning is like the core mechanic of Yu-Gi-Oh to get monsters onto the field. So if they want to play the game, they have two choices. They can either just do the bare minimum, maybe play a singular special summon to maybe break even on the Maxx C, and then pass the turn in some capacity after they've done the absolute bare minimum that they can, or they give me 20, 30 cards because they special summon everything that they can to try to fight back. If they do not kill me that turn, we call this the Maxx C challenge. If they do not win the Maxx C challenge and kill me that turn, I am going to win because I have 40 cards over you because you let me draw my whole deck with Maxx C. And the issue with this is because Maxx C, because we have hand traps, you're able to draw into more interruptions off of the Maxx C. You're able to draw into Ash Blossom. You're able to draw into Effect Veiler. And when Maxx C was printed, we didn't have all of these options like we do now. So this card is banned for us. It's actually legal in Japan, funny enough. And they have made new versions of Maxx C that are very... they're more balanced because they have a lot more restrictions on them, but people still have their feelings towards them.
Yeah, this card seems ludicrous.
Right, it's fucking disgusting, to be honest with you. And so let me show you like how much they had to nerf it comparatively to have a similar effect, because people have this theory they're going to phase Maxx C onto the ban list, but they want to bring these cards into the fray first to like act as a replacement. So this is Mulcharmy fuwalos. So essentially, this reads like Maxx C, but there's a lot of restrictions. So the first restriction, and this is probably the most important one, if you control no cards, it's a quick effect that you can discard this card to apply these effects. People's biggest gripe with Maxx C is the fact that I can do whatever I want, and now my opponent has to fight back, and I can Maxx C them, and there's really no downside to that. That's no different than me flipping Anti-Spell Fragrance on my opponent after I did the thing. So the fact that you have to control no cards means that if I set up my board and pass play, I cannot use fuwalos on my opponent so that they have to fight through this sort of lingering floodgate effect in addition to everything else, like you would have to with Maxx C, which makes it a lot better for when you lose the die roll and you're going second. This gives you, you know, a sort of way to fight back in that regard. The other thing they did is that they divided Maxx C into different zones. So there's multiple Mulcharmy monsters. The one I'm showing you here is probably like the best of the three, because this only affects special summons from either the deck or the extra deck. There's another one that's only monsters in the hand, and there's another one that's monsters from the graveyard or that are banished. So they split the power of Maxx C into 3 separate cards, kind of like Exodia in a funny way. And then they also have a limitation on how many cards you're able to actually have at maximum. If your opponent is +6 on you after using a Mulcharmy, you're probably still losing the game anyway. So the third part of the effect doesn't really matter all that much. But in any case, it shows that they took this extremely powerful, broken floodgate type effect, and they really had to do so much to rein in the power of this type of effect to make it more tolerable or more balanced, if you will. But Maxx C was printed over a decade ago. It was when the game wasn't nearly what it was now. So a lot of people say it's just like a symptom of, you know, the way that the game was back then. And that's understandable, but it's still an atrociously designed card.
Yeah, absolutely. It looked absolutely wild. I'm also trying to figure out what Maxx C is. Is it glittering dust beneath a...
They're like cockroaches. So like those are eyes. So they're like little insects that are like, you know, hiding under the C is a whole archetype in and of itself, but this is like one of the only good ones. Yeah, so they're all little cockroaches that are like hiding in someone's house.
It does. It sounds insane that, like, yeah, absolutely bonkers. Because again, I'm not trying to convince you all that the resource system is good around like mana and tempo, but in Magic, you wouldn't be able to just fire off all your stuff. They draw their cards and they fire off all their stuff. There's an example of this from like Maxx C in competitive 60-card Magic. I don't think off the top of my head there's any card that draws a card every time your opponent casts a creature. There's cards that do it for yourself because it's part of combos, right? But not for your opponent. But like there is one card that because there's an argument that with Maxx it's a skill tester, right? Where like, should you play into it? Probably not. But then, okay, I'll show you the Magic example, then I'll make the comparison to what I'm thinking about with Maxx here. So,
and while you pull that up, I'll just say, the issue is like, yes, it is a skill tester, but the problem is, as the game has evolved, both situations end in the opposing player losing. So there's not like a way to like skillfully play around it.
No, because that's what I was going to say. I'm saying skill tester because there are Magic equivalents, but in Magic, they're a skill tester because you have more time to react, if that makes sense. So the example that I give is probably Ristic Study, which is, for the record, a not good card in 60-card Legacy constructed, right? Like, this is not played because all it does is make cards cost 1 more. So Ristic Study says, whenever an opponent casts a spell, they may pay 1 extra. If they don't, you draw a card. In 1v1, it can be a bit backbreaking, but it's not efficient enough to be any good. In multiplayer 4-player Commander, this card is on the game changer list, which is basically not banned, but you shouldn't be playing these outside of like really high powered things because people do not respect it. It should read everyone pays 1 extra for their spells, but what it actually reads is when you go around a table of 4 people, 3 people just cast spells willy-nilly, and the player of the Ristic Study just draws 7 cards and untaps on their turn with more cards than everyone else. It's absolutely bonkers. But it's interesting because again, Maxx is in 1v1 and there's no cost to you to cast your things, nor to pay for the Maxx, right? So it's everything's turned up to 11 with the Yu-Gi-Oh because of the speed and the lack of a mana resource system. There obviously are resources in Yu-Gi-Oh! I guess Maxx in a way is highlighting that because the main resource is card draw, and card draw you said is quite hard to come by. So Maxx might be one of the best card draw spells you've ever seen in Yu-Gi-Oh!
Oh, yeah, 100%.
Would you say, if tomorrow you could register for an event and you were allowed to play 4 copies of Pot of Greed or 4 copies of Maxx? No, 3, sorry. 3 copies of Pot of Greed or 3 copies of Maxx. Which one do you think is more broken for you to take into a tournament where other people can't play it?
Wow, that's a question. It's interesting because both cards are really powerful, but they serve different purposes because
sure, absolutely.
3 copies of Pot of Greed would thin your deck significantly because at that point you're playing a 34 card deck essentially. Not to mention any other like ways to thin the deck out. So like your deck would be like ultra consistent. You'd have a lot of ways to do things.
And it's guaranteed draw too.
Right, but Maxx is also like this defensive countermeasure that like also prevents the opponent from playing the game as well, while also simultaneously drawing you cards, even if you don't get them immediately. So it's like their functions are completely different, but man, that's a... Honestly, I'd probably pick Pot of Greed because I haven't gotten to play Pot of Greed in years. But,
yeah,
but I mean, there's an argument for both. There's an argument for both.
Maxx reads how you should treat Ristic Study, which is you should not play into it because in Magic you've got time to recover from that. But in the Maxx situation, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, because you're effectively not playing anything for 4 turns. With Ristic Study, you're just like paying everything a turn off. But with Maxx, you're just spending 4 turns not playing Yu-Gi-Oh!
Well, and it's so interesting with Ristic Study, too, because even if one player draws 7, 10 cards off of it, because you have the mana system, they're limited in how much they can actually do with those cards, right? And where with Maxx, with Yu-Gi-Oh! Specifically, because we're only limited by what the cards say we can or cannot do, that just gives us so many more options to be able... And that's why, again, why we say it's like, you know, it's a lose-lose situation with Maxx more often than not. It's really funny because in older Yu-Gi-Oh! When Maxx was first printed, I think it was printed like 2011, 2012, so it's pretty old. Maxx was actually not considered particularly good because special summoning was not nearly as prolific as it has evolved and the game has amalgamized into what it is now. It only took a few years for people to start realizing, wait, this card is actually batshit crazy, and that's when it eventually, you know, slowly...
I love that, though. I love when old cards that were considered bad or just considered very mid, and the game evolves in such a way. We have things like that as well. Lion's Eye Diamond, without explaining it completely, it's a similar thing. It was like worth pennies, and now it's like $700 for a Lion's Eye because it's a card they can't reprint, and the thing it does where you discard your hand is actually bonkers now, because some decks want to just discard their hand and get effects out of it, right? So I love that. That's one of the coolest things about card games evolving and growing, right?
Yeah, and so I think when it comes to like Floodgates, what a majority of the Yu-Gi-Oh community, not that I want to speak for everyone, but the majority probably prefer is these types of interactions where there's actually a significant degree of counterplay. I would say a lot of people, where you're saying with Magic, Stax is sort of almost divided by the community, where it's like competitive players are like, Stax, whatever, and the casuals really hate it. I think definitively across most Yu-Gi-Oh players, most of them hate Floodgates unless they are, you know, similar to you, where they love actually playing like that as an archetype altogether. Yu-Gi-Oh players have it really, and especially the way that the card design is sort of shifted, we're starting to get to the point now where we have a lot of cards that have the ability to have quick effects, so they're used on the opponent's turn. but they're not doing things that preclude the opponent from playing the game, because that's a lot of the fun within Yu-Gi-Oh! Is being able to go like card for card with your opponent, really trying to find those choke points with your hand traps or your disruptive forms of interaction, and really just outplay your opponent in a lot of instances without there being these like definitive, oh, I win automatically because this card resolved type of effects.
What I've learned from this conversation, which I was kind of getting from Twitter a little bit, but it was a loud chorus of also people telling me I'm wrong when I was trying to ask questions. I was also being a bit flippant. I was like, this makes Yu-Gi-Oh! Sound like it's a mess, because that's how people were wording it. They're like, in our game,
Sure.
Floodgates, you just lose to them. But I guess what I'm learning is that Floodgates and Yu-Gi-Oh! Are a necessary evil that people put into their decks because it allows them to play the game, and most decks play some number of them.
Not necessarily. It is format dependent, but what typically people do with Floodgates is in game 1, when you bring your main deck into a competitive setting, unless there is like a combo with a particular strategy that's similar to what I said before, where there's a way to like roundabout search a floodgate because you know the metagame all loses to a particular floodgate, then that is what you're trying to do. But for the most part, all decks, when you bring them into a tournament in their first game, have what their deck is trying to do, and we sort of ignore the floodgates altogether, unless you're specifically playing like a stun floodgate strategy at like altogether. So what happens is in games 2 and 3, let's say I lose our first game together. I'm going to go into my side deck. I know that I get to declare to go first. I'm going to side in these floodgates because I know that because I'm going first, I have the opportunity to deploy these after I make my opening move. So whether or not you interact with my ability to produce whatever the board is that I'm trying to make, even if you stop it, I have this floodgate that as soon as this activates, like, I'm going to be in a winning position 9 times out of 10. Unless you have the out or your deck has the ability to like chew through this somehow, then I'm going to win the game. So let's say I win game 2, game 3 rolls around, you're going to do the same thing to me. So it's a lot of metagaming in the sideboard specifically with these floodgates, and that's what makes it really frustrating because you play more games sideboarded than not.
Of course,
and then it becomes not necessarily a game of, can I like outskill my opponent with like our decks? It's a matter of, can I outplay or can I destroy or outplay the floodgate and actually be able to play the game? And that's really frustrating for a lot of players at the top levels of competitive play.
So that explanation has actually completely changed how I'm perceiving this now, right? We've done a lot of talking about legacy prison decks, and we've talked a bit about the casual stuff and mediation and stuff. So for example, there's a format called Modern, which is 8th edition onwards, so it's like 2004 onwards. Importantly, prison decks are bad in it. They've never been good, they've never won a Pro Tour, they never do very well. However, the exact situation that you're saying exists. So prior to a recent like design philosophy change, there are cards in sideboards that you side into that ruin certain strategies. A really, really obvious one is Stony Silence. So let me show you this card. So it's like, this design is wonderful because it's so simple. It just says, activated abilities of artifacts can't be activated. So against decks that look to sacrifice all their artifacts into one artifact to make mana, or to put all their counters onto a creature by sacking and activating artifacts to do that, none of those things are available. Often those decks will also use mana rocks that produce mana, and those things will be turned off too. So some decks will just get bricked completely and can't activate. Some of the lands are artifact lands and they can't activate. And the argument always used to be that Modern as a format was bad. It's one of my favorite formats of all time, but it was bad because a lot of the post-board games became, did I draw my Stony Silence? And did you draw your answer to Stony Silence? And the same as Rest in Peace is another one which just turns off graveyards. Stony's artifacts, Rest in Peace is graveyards. Both of those cards were absolutely brutal to certain matchups in the metagame. What Wizards did as a design philosophy was to introduce more free spells, that's an argument whether that's good or not, and more interactive things to try and make the format more interactive. What really happened was all that interaction was in the expensive premium price sets that rotated the format, so everyone had to buy into this.
Of course.
So the gameplay pattern is better, but the format looks nothing like it used to. All your old cards aren't playable, you have to play the new stuff. So there's swings and roundabouts there. So actually, this isn't prison decks and Magic are fine. This is Yu-Gi-Oh! Sounds like Modern circa 2016, 2015, where sideboards determine games and you play more games sideboarded. And thus the sideboard silver bullets, we call them, the thing that can kill a werewolf, silver bullets, are the problem. So that's, I think, what Floodgates are more comparable to, are the sideboard cards that absolutely ruin your opponent.
I would 100% agree. So here's a good example. This is at current present moment Yu-Gi-Oh! So here's a card called Artifact Lancia. It's a wall of text. The short of it is it's a hand trap, and when you tribute it from your hand instead of discard, it's the same thing. neither player can banish cards for the rest of the turn. One of the best decks currently in the format is called Malice. Malice's main function as a deck, the thing that the monsters do, is banish themselves or exile them to do things. Typically, when they're banished, they get like special summoned, or like just banishing is the core mechanic that this deck is surrounding itself with. And so in games 2 and 3, no one is mainboarding Artifact Lancia because the other decks in the format don't care about Artifact Lancia in the slightest. So this is a silver bullet, just like you were saying. So games 2 and 3 roll around, everyone sideboards in their Artifact Lancias, and then if you just happen to, you know, your turn comes around, you do your thing, your opponent starts their turn, you Lancia them, they're like, fuck, can't play the game, that was real fun, you know. And again, like Lancia specifically, because it's a hand trap, there's very few ways to interact with it unless they happen to draw the out, right? That's not very fun. So it is actually almost exactly like what you're saying with Modern, and that's really interesting.
There's an archetype called Affinity that was famously the best deck in Modern at any point when no one was prepared for it. So let's say Jund and other archetypes were really good. Everyone's like, well, I'm going to this tournament. I'm not going to put 4 copies of Stony Silence on my sideboard. I don't think anyone's playing Affinity. You rock up, your first round is against Affinity. This has happened to me. Affinity bulldozes you because it's the fastest deck in the format. You look at your sideboard and you're like, I wish I had my Stony Silencers. So Affinity was always the best deck in the format whenever people were not prepared for it, because it's the deck that was the most susceptible. It was a, what we call in video games as well, a glass cannon, right? It's very good and powerful, but you slam a Stony Silence and they haven't got the 3 cards from their sideboard to count the Stony Silence, they lose. So yeah, I think the Floodgate problem in Yu-Gi-Oh! Sounds very similar to the situation that Magic had with Modern, and still has to a lesser extent in the older formats where singular cards completely destroy certain archetypes and stuff. But arguably there's more counterplay as time has gone on and they've printed more interaction. Similar to what you said, where the design philosophy is moving towards hand traps to interact with them and stuff.
Right. Let me tell you about one of the most egregious offenders here. We'll probably wrap this up here. This is one that everyone loves. So this one's called Mystic Mine. So this
I've heard of this card. I've heard of this card.
Okay. This will be good. This will be good. I'd love to hear your take on this. So Mystic Mine is a field spell. A field spell is like an enchantment that has its own designated zone that each player has one of, but it stays out until something interacts with it. So Mystic Mine reads, for anyone who doesn't know what this card is, if your opponent controls more monsters than you do, your opponent cannot activate monster effects or declare an attack. If you control more monsters than your opponent does, you cannot activate monster effects or declare an attack. And once per turn during the end phase, if both players control the same number of monsters, destroy this card. Now, this card had a very interesting trajectory. Initially, this was the best burn card ever printed for Yu-Gi-Oh! The reason for that is Yu-Gi-Oh! Is so monster effect centric that you literally just printed a way to negate all monster effects and prevent them from killing you in a singular card. And remember, like I said, because Yu-Gi-Oh! Is so monster-centric, and a lot of people aren't really playing, in their main deck especially, ways to destroy spells and trap cards, because since we have our extra deck is the 15 cards that are essentially a toolbox to access at any moment. People have spell and trap removal at their disposal in the extra deck, but that's a monster effect, so Mystic Mine is a way to just keep that in check. So burn players loved this card because they would just, you know, look at their opponent and say, activate Mystic Mine. They don't control any monsters. Their opponent controls, you know, however many. And they would just play burn cards and just slowly kill the opponent. And the opponent had no way to out it. So it was fantastic. The problem with this card is that combo players and people who played real decks figured out, we can just play this in regular decks. And if our opponent doesn't have an out to this card, we just deck them out. So the play pattern for this card was, I go first, I play a bunch of cards, and because we have a lot of tutors, you're thinning your deck out by, you know, 5-7 cards in your first turn, right? So I'm going to do my thing, whatever, pass the turn. You, as someone who has Mystic Mine, is going to go, okay, maybe I have a way to negate a spell or trap on my field. So you bait that out first, and now, okay, everything's clear, activate Mystic Mine. If Mystic Mine resolves, and I do not have a non-monster effect way to destroy Mystic Mine, I literally will deck out over the course of 30 turns because I have no way to destroy this card. And so that is what Yu-Gi-Oh! Devolved into for a very short period of time, is that when people were going second in like games 2 and 3, they would bring in copies of Mystic Mine, and this was the whole game. They didn't care about winning the game through traditional 8,000 damage. Their whole goal was to stick Mystic Mine and just win the game through deck out, because there's literally feature match articles of saying like, player A drew pass, player B drew pass, and it's that just like over and over copied for like an entire 2-page document, because that's what this card enables. But so people would have to then side in their outs to Mystic Mine so that they'd actually have a way to play the game. Then it became this game of chicken, because the player playing Mystic Mine now knows, okay, my opponent is smart enough to bring in these cards to destroy the Mystic Mine. I'm able to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Under Mystic Mine because my effects are not negated. As long as I can do everything that I can to destroy my opponent's board, then find a way to disable my own Mystic Mine and then just kill them, it became this like whole like crazy dynamic where people would bring in Mystic Mine and then people would have to play the outs to Mystic Mine, then people would stop playing Mystic Mine, so people would take out the outs to Mystic Mine, and it just kept like ping-ponging back and forth until finally they banned this fucking atrocious card. So yeah, very interesting design there.
And just to make sure I understand, you can't activate or declare attacks, right? So is discarding a hand trap creature also an activation?
Let me make sure. It says your opponent cannot activate monster effects or yes. So even effects in hand cannot be activated.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Because like this card would be this would be broken in Magic, even at like 3 or 4 mana, I think. Because like,
oh yeah, this card's disgusting. This card is unbelievable.
So I've read it 3 times. I was listening to your explanation more. If they have more creatures than me,
correct,
they cannot attack and they cannot cast creatures or activate creatures.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah. It's super ensnaring and bridge / water bones. There are cards like it, but they are like 3 to 6 mana. And they're still,
and this is free.
Yeah, and these are also, they've got loads of caveats on them. So ensnaring bridge is the closest thing I can think of off the top of my head. But it says like it's creatures with power equal to the number of cards, less than the number of cards in your hand can't attack. So it's like there's loads of loops. There's loads of like hoops to jump through. So if you can't empty your hand, it doesn't do anything. If I could just slam a 3 mana spell that said you just cannot attack ever. Yeah, this is pretty good.
Yeah, this is nasty. This is nasty.
Yeah, this is good stuff. The one thing I wanted to mention, just as like in terms of the stax pieces that were egregious in Magic, was that there was a small period just before we got into the thing called Fire Design, where they power crept everything, where they started printing like one-sided stax pieces, and it was the one in the original tweet that they showed. They showed Teferi, 3 mana Teferi. Basically, there's a load of Planeswalkers that all had static text on them. Planeswalkers are a whole thing that I'm not gonna labor right now. They're basically like a spell you cast, and when it hits the board, it can every turn cast a new spell off of it. But Teferi says each player can't cast they can only cast spells when they can cast a sorcery. So the instance turned off. Basically. Yeah, but there's more than that. There's things like if you cast a spell that cascades, so you reveal cast top of your library, and you hit a card and try to cast it. If you've cascaded off a sorcery, this sorcery is going at instant speed and it can't, so that fails. There's loads of fringe cases where things don't work, but the important thing, so what Teferi would allow you to do is you resolve this. Your counter magic still works, their counter magic doesn't. So your Ash Blossoms still work, theirs do not. And then the really egregious one that I actually fell a little bit in love with it's the Stony Silence we talked about, but it's on a body that allows you to go into your extra deck, your sideboard, sorry. So this card, Karn, says opponents can't activate abilities on their artifacts, which is what we said about Stony earlier, or your example was Artifact Lancia in a way. Mm-hmm. But imagine if then the thing that's doing that also says -2, look into your sideboard, or your side deck as you call it.
That's crazy.
Yep. And then get any card that has the artifact type. And the one thing it used to get to finish the game is one of our Mystic Mines. So what it would do is you'd play this, your opponent's already struggling because it's turning off stuff, but maybe their deck has no artifacts. Maybe you're playing creatures to block and stop this from being killed. And then you grab Mycos Inflatus. And Mycos Inflatus isn't Mystic Mine, but it is Mystic Mine when combined with Karn. So it says, all permanents are artifacts in addition to the other types. And Karn says opponents' artifacts can't be activated. That includes their lands. So if you stick this on a board where they can't attack and kill Karn or can't remove Karn, their lands no longer work, their creatures can attack and block, but they can't activate anything else. They can't make mana or tap things to activate them. They can only attack and block. But the important thing is, you only go for this combo when you've got like a 4/4 in play. They've got a 2/2. They can never attack Karn, and now they can't resolve any more creatures. They can't do anything. And then if you have got more cards in your library than they have, you just pass back and forth until they die. So it's not quite Mystic Mine, but it is like
Mystic Mine with extra steps.
Yeah, it's a 10 mana. 10 mana, have to protect your Planeswalker. Go into your side deck, get a card. Mystic Mine. And interestingly, Mycos Inflatus is currently banned in Modern, the format, like I said, where silver bullets are a pain in the backside. So it's an interesting comparison. Again, I'm trying to grab comparisons and similarities, but again, because the resource system, we have to spend 10 mana and get to a point where our creature is bigger than yours in order to do our Mystic Mine, essentially.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
And we get to do it for free. And not to mention, Mystic Mine is tutorable. We have ways to search Mystic Mine, which is even more disgusting on top of it. So.
I mean, the moment I read that card, I was like, this sounds like my kind of card. Like, players can't do things, players can't... Yeah, this is my kind of thing.
Yeah, it was definitely a very controversial card in the Yu-Gi-Oh sphere for quite some time. There's only like 2 people that are happy this card is still legal, or were upset that this card got banned. Let me say the reverse of that. Yeah, but this was a really interesting discussion. I think at the end of it all, like, you know, Floodgates, Stax, Prison, all that stuff. We just all love card games at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's really fascinating to just like compare and contrast like how cards that, you know, you might perceive to be like, oh, this is fine, and then we might perceive to be like the most broken thing ever, or vice versa, and how it just affects our respective games, because our games are so like just drastically different, just inherently. But I think that's what makes these conversations so interesting at the end of the day. So thank you so much for joining me.
No, thank you. And this was really useful because although you're saying our games are different, after us having the conversation, I'm like, oh, this is the modern problem that everyone complains about.
Yeah,
it's
they're
the same thing.
Quite similar.
It's like the same thing.
It's
the same thing. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, you know, as much as Magic players and Yu-Gi-Oh players always want to, you know, go back and forth with each other, we're all just people who like card games at the end of the day.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Pleasant Kenobi, thank you again so much. It was an absolute pleasure. Maybe we'll have you back on in the future if people like
this.
Yeah,
absolutely.
We'll
love it.
But thank you. So guys, that's going to wrap it up for another video. I really hope you all enjoyed. Let's go ahead and shout the patrons for all of their continued support. So shout outs to Shout1317, Tim00x3, MBT Play Medolce, Moto, Cameron L. Smith, The Synchro Guy, Pony Stark, Dan the Man Hoban, Little Fadeleaf, Draconic, Dylan Rare Hunter, JW11860, Flannel Daddy, literally all of the guinea pigs, Cheeks McLapperty, Stolfin Amethyst, MBT Cancel by all community soon, Cancel by all committee soon, Cancel by all players soon, Wonder Waffle, MBT and Nimnims, One Boxer Brief Fueled Knight of Passion, Daniel Howell, Electrician of the Ice Barrier, Astro Random, Arco, and the Nova 129. Thank you guys so much again for watching, and we will see you next time.